So Miriam, you've got some verses from Ecclesiastes to share with us to open tonight.
Yes, Jason. So I'm reading from Ecclesiastes 3. So there are several voices in Ecclesiastes. So I'm reading from one of those. So it's verses 16 to 22. Yet I notice that under the sun, there is crime where justice should be, and the corrupt where the good should be. I told myself that God will judge both the good and the corrupt, and the appointed. I told myself that God will judge both the good and the corrupt at the appointed time for every issue and for every deed. I told myself that God tests us to teach us that we're just like the animals. For our fate and the fate of all living things are the same. As one dies, so dies the other. We all have the same breath, and we have no advantage over the other forms of life. It's all a mist of air. We all go to the same place. All forms of life are from dust and return to dust. Who knows whether our soul really goes up while an animal's soul goes down? In short, I see there is nothing better than that we enjoy our work, for this is our destiny. Who among us can see what will come after us? And so I've chosen this because, some commentators have said that Christianity, some strands of Christianity are highly anthropocentric. They place humans over and above others in creation. So, and yet in this text, this is a great leveler. So a great leveler between humans and other creatures. So as in Ecclesiastes, we see this kind of grappling with injustice and grappling with mortality and grappling with futility. We see humans and other creatures on an equal plane. So it's an important text for us to reflect on when there is a tendency in some strands and some traditions to put humans at the center. This works against that tendency.
Thanks, Miriam. And Jess, you've got a Uniting Church specific reading for us, which also attempts to broaden the scope of God's concern.
Yeah, Jason, I always love to come back to paragraph 3 of the Basis of Union, which is the foundational document of the Uniting Church. And the basis says, God in Christ has given to all people in the church the Holy Spirit as a pledge and foretaste of that coming reconciliation and renewal, which is the end in view for the whole creation. The church's call is to serve that end. And I guess the way that I've always read that passage and the way that I've got hope from it is this idea that the church's call is to serve God's end of the reconciliation and renewal of all creation. So it is in fact a core duty and call of the church in serving God to be part of God's reconciliation and renewal for all creation.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. The Faith Ecology Network, who we're putting this discussion together for, emphasises the role of science and the need for faiths to listen to science, to be inspired to protect the precious biodiversity of the planet. And one of the quotes that I love from the Uniting Church is also from the basis, where it says that in particular, the Uniting Church enters into the inheritance of literary, historical and scientific inquiry, which has characterized recent centuries and gives thanks for the knowledge of God's ways with humanity, which are open to an informed faith. Miriam, I wonder if you could reflect for a moment on some of the ways in which the Uniting Church has listened to science and responded.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think it depends on how we understand science and what we mean by it. I think what we've seen is an engagement, not so much a direct engagement with science necessarily, as engagement with those with whom the church would seek to be in solidarity, and that includes a scientific conversation. So as part of that complex engagement, the role that science plays. So, I mean, in its first decades, there was opposition in the Uniting Church to uranium mining, for example. So we've seen that, again and again in those early decades. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a particular focus on climate change. I think, that was driven in the first instances by concerns from neighbouring churches in the Pacific, but broader now. And in both cases, there's an engagement with science. And another one would be, Jason, you and I particularly were both involved, between 5 and 10 years ago in conversations about the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So those were conversations around science, what was sustainable water diversion from the basin, but also voices of people living in the basin. So these really quite engaged conversations with science and affected communities. When the Uniting Church decided to divest from fossil fuels, that was very much driven by an understanding of how much carbon dioxide could be released into the atmosphere safely or relatively safely, and the need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. So scientific conversations all through that, Jason. Yep.
Thanks. Jess, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, in my work with the 5-Leaf Eco Awards and finding churches who are doing amazing things for the environment, one of the kind of problems that I've had is just how many of the churches involved are from the Uniting Church. And so that's often given people the impression that it's a Uniting Church program rather than an ecumenical program. But it's kind of a good problem to have, in the sense that the reason there are so many Uniting Churches involved is because so many have listened not just to the science, but also, I believe, to the call of God to be involved in this environmental work. I think we've seen all around the world that the Holy Spirit has been active in getting churches to take action against climate change and to care for God's creation. And they've done that, informed and inspired by the science, but also trying to serve God well. And our Uniting Churches have done an amazing job of that. Many of them have done really, really wonderful things for the environment and have been doing so for decades. And they will continue to be informed in that by both the science and their faith.
Another core aspect of the Uniting Church's identity is its covenant with the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, or the UAICC. The Uniting Church acknowledges that the first peoples had already encountered the Creator God before the arrival of the colonisers. The Spirit was already in the land, revealing God through custom and ceremony and law. And so the first peoples in Australia have unique insights into God's ways in Australia. Unfortunately, Pastor Ray Minniecon's not able to join us tonight, but we'll include a reflection that Ray gave.
The Bible is tribal. It comes from a tribal group over there in the Middle East, and that we have this opportunity or invitation to actually look at that particular message with tribal eyes. We also know that Jesus was a tribal man. He came from the tribe of Judah. We live not in a disconnected world, we live in a world that is connected to each other. And so the trees and the animals and the stars and the moons and the whole landscape there, the rocks and the mountains, are all part of our family, brothers and sisters and all of that. So we identify with those particular aspects of the landscape and of all living things, because of our belief systems, which we believe came from what white man calls the dreaming. The loss of all of these beautiful species that are a part of our family has been a part of our pain and a part of our suffering as Indigenous peoples. Indigenous theology starts in Genesis 1. Bereshit Elohim, in the beginning, God. And that's a much more better starting point. Because as you go through, even in the first book of Genesis, you look at the last verse of the first chapter, and he says that everything is good, very good. All that he has created is good. It's good for all of us. Like Aboriginal people would say, we're all related to everything. Every life form is a part of what he created back there in the beginning. And that's when you can see, in terms of the message that Jesus came to restore, it's not just to save me from my own personal sins. He died to save the whole universe. And so salvation to me is, how do we then not just save ourselves, but save the blooming planet that we live in, his creation, our land and our mother.
The Uniting Church also identifies as a multicultural church, and in New South Wales, ACT, a significant proportion of our members were born on one of the Pacific Islands or have parents or grandparents who were. The Uniting Church started in the 70s, which was around about the time when the push for a more truly Pacific theology, a post-colonial theology, started to emerge. And the Western part of the Uniting Church has increasingly been challenged to listen to Pacific voices amongst its members and the insights that they have to offer as well. Lofa, I wonder if you want to kick us off in this section by reflecting on some of the insights from Pacific theologies.
Thanks, Jason. First of all, I am of Tongan heritage, and I do acknowledge that I do not speak for all Pacifica. I can only contribute from a Tongan sort of perspective. Now, one of my favorite sayings is in Tongan is the koe whanua ai tangata, koe tangata ai whanua, meaning the land is the people and the people is the land. And so for me, I believe that one of the major, most significant contributions of Pacifica theology is to remind us about starting with the community, and which is people, and the people are the land. And so the relationships of those people also defines who we are. And when you move off from people, you also have the connectedness in there as well. And when you don't have connections with each other, you are displaced, and then you're displaced from the land as well. Now, so many of our concepts looks at, in terms of the word whanua that I mentioned earlier, looks at the land, and it also means the womb of a woman. The whanua, it also means the ocean. So there's, and it also, did I mention it also means the womb of a woman? Okay. So all those concepts, I believe, reminds us, those of us in theology, and I guess every other different people in different areas of life, reminds us that the land is not a separate thing to us, and that we are a part of the land, and therefore we should live in relationships, have a close relationship to the land, and we should always have respect for the land like we have for one another. And once we disrespect the land, it's the same way as us disrespecting our family, our friends, and those who are close to us. Yeah, I think that's just a short way of my contribution to this.
Yeah, thanks, Lofa. You said family there at the end, and I guess my abiding interest in evolution lends itself to talk about family and humans being part of the Earth family. And I know that's something that Ray talks about quite a lot from Aboriginal spirituality. So, like, is that an appropriate way of expressing things in a Tongan understanding as well, in terms of like the family of Earth and in terms of humans and our relationship to other creatures, or would you express that differently?
No, that's pretty much it. And we use the term kāinga in terms of family. And so to have no land is not, it means not having family. Okay. So they both kind of represent each other.
So, I mean, that is that when we talk about, what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives can contribute, what Pacifica perspectives contribute, I think what's important to say is that, those of us from other perspectives and backgrounds, to make space to listen and to recognise the leadership from those communities and to stand in solidarity alongside these peoples. And that process can lead to change of heart, change of mind, change of perspective over time. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a practical element to this. And so the ideas are obviously very important, but I think it starts, you know, when we're talking about relationship and family and so on, it starts with relationship and standing alongside. So, and in the Uniting Church Synod of New South Wales and ACT, the Climate Action Strategy talks about the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and also Pacifica perspectives and making space to listen to those perspectives.
Another aspect of that, Miriam, of course, is that, as has been talked about in the Uniting Church, often it's the people living in the Pacific Islands and a number of Aboriginal communities, particularly the remoter ones, that are experiencing, you know, the first tumult from climate change, and yet are amongst the lowest emitters in the world. So that sense of the kind of double injustice that's been going on, which has kind of led to the need to listen to the experiences of people on the front lines of climate change, but also with a different theological slant to contribute to the solution. That's
right. So not only as victims of injustice, to use that terms, but as peoples with great strength and much to contribute, whose leadership should be acknowledged.
I mean, I think there's a real privilege too in the opportunity that we often get in the Uniting Church, and for me it has been mostly through church friendships and connections, to be able to listen to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Pacifica peoples, and some of those friendships have helped me to learn so much, and particularly about eco-theology, and it's been a really powerful experience, and I'm really grateful to be part of a church that allows me to have those experiences. But I think, you know, relationships are two-way, and I can't think about my friendships and relationships with people in the Pacific without thinking about, for example, my friend Reverend James Bhagwan. And the first time that I ever met him, he was talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And, you know, we all just kind of look at the story and, oh, isn't it nice? You know, the Samaritan man helps the man who got beaten up, and, you know, takes him to the hotel, and that's kind of the end of the story. But James's challenge to us was, you know, what if this is actually a thing that's happening every day? What if there are multiple travelers every day, you know, on that road to Jericho who are getting beaten up? Is there always going to be a Samaritan to kind of help them and rescue them and take them to the hotel? Like, at what point do we actually say, instead of helping the beaten up man, we actually need to do something about the road? We actually need to prevent people from being beaten up. And the link that he was making with that was to climate change. And, you know, when we see these big cyclones in places like Fiji, Cyclone Winston, huge amounts of damage, millions and millions of dollars worth of damage, and to people and lives and livelihoods. And Australia tends to be reasonably generous in the way that we respond to those disasters. But we're not doing anything about the road. We're only ever cleaning up after those individual disasters. What we need to actually be doing is taking action on climate change so that our brothers and sisters in the Pacific, you know, actually have a chance of not having constantly worsening cyclones. And yeah, so if we are actually following Jesus's parable and actually caring about our brothers and sisters and our neighbours, then that requires some serious action on climate change.
One of the things that I think openness to a diversity of perspectives and the depth from Indigenous perspectives, both here and in the Pacific, is then when we are involved in campaigns, often those campaigns can be quite pragmatic. So, 100% clean energy or green energy, renewable energy, for example, whereas our theology can lead us to a deeper position that's about relationship, that is about simple living, that is about deep justice. And, then if we read about what it takes in terms of rare earth metals to convert the globe to renewable energy, we start seeing all kinds of challenges around mining for those metals. So what it points towards, as far as I see it, is that if there is a temptation to look at techno fixes, and if there is a temptation to repeat slogans around green energy or clean energy, there's a deeper system in which we're all embedded, and which any transition to another energy supply leads us with its own set of issues. So to ask those deep questions is to question, I think, a deeper logic than around the technology that powers our society. So that's a huge challenge to those of us, in the church, when we think around how do we reconcile those issues around the pragmatics of campaigning and the deep change that is necessary if we're taking these theologies really seriously, and how we live that out day to day. It's beyond pragmatism, and it's beyond the short term.
One of the Faith Ecology Network's hopes is that people will be inspired to get active and not anxious in moving to protect biodiversity on the planet. But Jess, you had a different take on that apparent dichotomy between anxiety and action. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a case of either or. I think often our anxiety is actually what leads us into action. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge our emotions and that we have safe places to share them. Because actually, I think a reasonable person should be anxious about the climate and about what's happening with our world. So it's not the anxiety that's a problem. It's trying to find healthy ways to live with that anxiety. And that often means action, particularly action in community. And trying to find ways to get some support to be anxious, but also be hopeful and active, and doing something with that. And so that has been one of the focuses of the climate pastoral care conferences that we've been holding in the Uniting Church, to actually bring climate psychologists and church leaders and pastoral carers together and talk about, how do we actually treat or help people with climate anxiety and climate grief, and those kinds of emotions, because they are experiencing them in our churches, and we need to know that we're not alone.
Thanks, Jess. And we'll have the links to those conferences in the YouTube description, as well as on the Faith Ecology Network page, as we will to links to everything that we've talked about tonight, and there's plenty of it. In 2021, the Faith Ecology Network collaborated with the Affinity Intercultural Foundation around the theme of faiths regenerating wonder and the will to care. Lofa, does wonder play any role for you in your relationship with the rest of creation?
I think all the time. The way I see it is, when you wander into something beautiful in creation, for instance, when you go for a walk at the beach, those morning walks where the ocean hits the sand and the land, and you just stand there in awe of that, the whole scenery of it. But you can't stop but wonder about the hands of the Creator, who has formed, the bits and pieces of the sand and the rocks and all of that. And so for me, I don't take those moments lightly. Each moment of touching creation, of being in awe of creation, for me, is that you wonder about the Creator, who it is that's created that scenery, or whatever beauty it is that you come across.
Thanks, Luffa. I'll ask you and ask Miriam and Jess in a moment if you've had any kind of particular moment of wonder that stands out for you. I was just up at the New England National Park in the Gondwanan rainforest a couple of weeks ago, and I had that sense of just not being able to wrap my head around the fact that I was standing in a rainforest, which, if I'm remembering right, for about 90 million years has been there. Like, trees have obviously, hatched from their seed and grown and died, but that ecosystem has been there, for about 90 million years, and we're just a tiny flash in the pan of that. So that sense of wonder at being there, kind of counterposed, I guess, by the knowledge that, there's a reasonable chance that only one or two more generations of humans are going to get to sit there in that rainforest if we don't address climate change adequately, as our part of the coast dries out and as fires become more frequent. There's a really real chance that entire forest will be gone and replaced with eucalypts. So trying to hold in my head the wonder at this incredibly ancient landscape, but also just the wonder that it could so quickly be destroyed by human beings. Jess, do you have a kind of moment that comes to you?
For me, it's really about tall trees. So my kind of heart place, I guess, is the Eucalyptus regnans, or mountain ash forests in Victoria around the Dandenongs and things. When I look at those tall white trunks, it just lifts my heart right up to God in an amazing way. And the Karri forests in Western Australia as well. There's just something about them that's magical to me.
Miriam?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about some of the things in my neighborhood and wonder in the small. So watching worms come out onto the footpath when it's raining, or with my niece, there's a water dragon that actually comes and visits them at home, and with my niece pointing out the water dragon and looking at the water dragon. And then these days I'm an avid reader of The Conversation, and there are often just some wonderful articles about magpies, about small mice, various species, various creatures that just, I think, wow, wonderful. And I'm filled with awe as well about these creatures, and how other they are from us, and yet how they often communicate with us as well.
So the Faith Ecology Network aims to discern and to foster religious reasons for environmental advocacy. So I thought we'd close our session tonight just by talking about one or two reasons that we have for being involved in this process of the reconciliation and renewal of the whole creation. Like what are some of our motivations? Jess, can I start with you maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I see God as a God of life. a God who very deeply loves and is present within all of creation. And therefore, I think it's absolutely critical as a Christian disciple, and it's core work for our churches to actually care for God's creation, and to try and protect it, and love it as God does. And so, yeah, I think it's sinful the way that we have often treated the environment. Extinction is a sin. We need to be protecting our biodiversity, and we need to be, loving all of God's creatures, both because of who they are and their intrinsic value and their value to God who loves them, and also because they're sacraments, because we know God through watching creation. Thomas Berry said something I found quite inspiring, which was essentially that if we lived on the moon instead of on Earth, we would actually have a very different idea of God, because our idea of God would kind of reflect the barrenness of the moon instead of this incredible abundance and life that we have all around us, and that has shaped our faith since its very beginnings. So the earth and the creatures are in fact this incredible source and well of connection and faith for us with God, and we need them. And every time we lose a species, we lose part of that, and we actually, reduce our ability to see and understand God.
Thanks, Jess. Loffa, what about you? What are one or two aspects of your faith that motivate you in this work?
Thank you, Jason, and thanks, Jess. I was about to say amen. I mean, I guess for me, growing up in Tonga, growing up in a culture that's always loved creation and seeing creation as part of itself. And one of the interesting things I came to realize a few years ago was, we in Tonga or in the Pacific, we have this, we often say, this is the time of darkness. And then when the missionaries came, this is the time the light came to us, and now we're Christianized, and so we became religious. And I think I disagree with that, because I believe that the way we lived with in harmony with creation, and the way we looked at the different gods that we had, I believe that made us really religious, and we were always aware that there was a God with us. And so for me, I don't believe that Pacific people became religious because of the missionaries. I believe that we've always been very religious people. I mean, we had these gods who lived in the ocean. We had gods in the skies and all of that. So I believe that's been one of my motivations. And these days, what's motivated me to stay on and advocate and become passionate about climate actions and climate change, obviously because of the Pacific. But I believe that, I'm really sad seeing the younger generation having to fight for a future. Something I didn't really think about in my high school days. So a lot of it is to do with young people seeking a better future than what our governments and what we're doing to creation, hurting creation and all of that. And that for me is pretty much, those things are the things that informs my faith to keep on going and be part of these conversations and the discipleship that we as a church have.
Thanks, Loffa. Miriam.
Yeah, so for me, many motivations, and when we say, I guess, religious motivation, what is and what isn't religious, and I think that's what you're saying there too, Lofa. Around, yeah, how do we define these things? And these are very, very deep things about who we are. One for me, if we look at the life of Jesus, so Jesus made a stand in the public sphere against injustice. And so turning the table in the temples because of exploitation of the poor by temple authorities. So, if Christians seek to follow Jesus, I do, then that's my example. I need to be involved in advocacy. And also, I guess we see that Jesus, it was often, it was in response to an initiative by somebody else who was excluded. So, on the lectionary, we're looking at the Gospel of Mark. So the Syrophoenician woman, the unnamed woman who bled for 12 years. So people who were excluded and on the margins, who they themselves took an initiative, and then Jesus responded to that initiative. So, for me as well, who I guess, I come from a line of people on the privileged side of history. It's important to stand in solidarity with young people, in solidarity with First Nations people, in solidarity with Pacifica people, in solidarity with my neighbours in creation, and other creatures in creation. Yeah, and another one Jess talked about from the basis of union, the reconciliation and renewal, that is the end in view for all creation, and the church's call is to serve that end. So for us in the Uniting Church, we understand this work to be deeply about mission.
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. I find Jesus' words about not being able to serve God and mammon or money keep kind of echoing to me. It's a hard teaching to put into practice living in a capitalist society, as we all do, which is built entirely around serving money and acquiring it in order to get influence. I guess a bit, Lofa, when you were talking, I was reflecting afterwards that, my passion for caring about, the environment and other animals preceded Christianity by a lot in my own life. When I became a Christian in my 20s, it was quite challenging for a while because the church I was part of was very focused on, the end times and when we would escape from the burning earth and go up into heaven. So quite a lot of people didn't see a lot of point in looking after the earth. So I was very excited to come across the basis of union, our statements to the nation as well. So not only the reconciliation and renewal of the whole creation, but the statements to the nation that talk about how in the Uniting Church we will, challenge greed and acquisitiveness, how creation is good in and of itself, and not just for its usefulness to human beings. Talked about the covenant with Aboriginal and Islander peoples. So that, I guess I was already motivated, but those kinds of statements have really encouraged me in continuing on, and made me very glad to be a part of the Uniting Church, trying to engage in care for the earth, because there's so much in our tradition that really supports that. Thanks all of you for joining us tonight, Jess and Miriam and Lofa, as we've put together a reflection on some, a reflection by some Uniting Church people, a bit of a personal reflection and a bit of relating to our particular tradition within the Christian Church for the Faith Ecology Network. If you're watching this, then the links to everything that we've talked about will be on the website and in the YouTube description. And we hope that you find what we've presented interesting and the links fruitful as you seek your own encouragement, working for the reconciliation and renewal of the whole creation.